Wars in space are as much a topic of fiction as it is now an imminent reality. Halford Mackinder, the famed geostrategist, once said, "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. And who rules the world island commands the world." Many decades after Mackinder, it is now asserted that the Earth's orbit could be the new world island. And where there is a world island, there is a contest. And where there is a contest, there is likely to be war. We discuss this facet in this episode of Orbital Rendezvous. I am Chaitanya Giri. Today we have with us Paul Szymanski. He's worked closely with the US Department of Defense for nearly 50 years. He has been a space military strategist and is an authority in the domain of military sciences. Paul, very happy to host you on Interstellar.
Well, thank you for having me.
Paul, let me ask you my first question of this interview. Is space warfare real? Have you ever had skirmishes in outer space?
Yeah, there's been about 10 space wars since the 1970s. I have a whole briefing on that. Sort of skirmishes or whatever you want to call it. There's been a lot of incidents. Going back to the 1960s, I think there was one. I can go over every one of those if you want. But the one in particular that I could actually mathematically proved by the orbital dynamics was the United States attacked Russian GLONASS satellites. They're GPS navigational satellites. They attacked them in 2014. And I can show you that every time they came over this site in Australia, they would blink out starting exactly at 6:30 a.m. Local time in Australia, Central Australia, Pine Gap. And if there were several Russian GLONASS satellites within view, they would blink out in numerical order, GLONASS 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so forth. I'm sure there are additional incidents happening with the current Ukrainian terrestrial conflict. I can't prove any of them. Now, there has been attack on Viasat satellite modems early in the war last year. And it destroyed, I think, 10,000 modems. I don't know, somehow a cyber attack attacked it. And it appears to me that in order to attack those ground-based satellite modems in Europe, because the Ukrainians were using the Viasat for military communications, in order to attack them, the best way to do that is to go through the Viasat satellite in geosynchronous orbit and bounce it back down the cyber code to the modem. So in a sense, that was a cyber warfare attack on the satellite. Now, there's 3 or 4 main ways one can attack satellites. One is, the Star Wars kind of thing, go against the satellite. But the other thing is go against the ground terminals, because satellites are completely worthless if you seal them off from the Earth, that you can't communicate with them. You can't tell them to do something, to point their imagery sensors certain ways, to downlink that data and so forth. So you can go against the satellite, you can go against the ground receiver terminal, or you can go against the link between the two, jamming or something like that. And I say there's a fourth theoretical. If you sort of can insert yourself in the satellite supply chain years earlier and put some sort of cyber code on a chip that is going to end up in the satellite, that's another way of doing it. Now, that's the pedestrian view of space, or space warfare. But space warfare is actually kind of beyond that. There's other ways to, in the United States, we say skin a cat, but you can have diplomatic or economic pressure, legal pressure, space treaties. For years, Russia and China were trying to have the United Nations put together space weapons treaties because they knew the U.S. was ahead and the U.S. would never agree with it and so forth. And lately, the United States has been talking about, oh, we should have a test ban treaty of what's called direct ascent and anti-satellites, ASATs. And that is some missile on the ground shoots up and, damages, blows apart a satellite, something that India actually had done a few years ago, Shakri or something, I forget. And it's kind of a funny treaty in that if you look at it, it says, oh, yeah, well, don't create space debris, which is bad, yeah. And for, missiles being shot from the ground. But it says nothing about a missile being shot from space to space, something that's up there already. I mean, the Russians on their Almaz manned space station had a anti-aircraft cannon in it. You could look it up online. They'll show you a picture of it and so forth. So that was a space to space attack. Now, there's no such thing as shooting down a satellite. It's still up there if you damaged it. So I'm not sure how they would work on this Almaz anti-aircraft cannon, where you'd have, let's say, some threatening satellite coming at you, and you shoot this artillery anti-aircraft shell at it, and you blow it up, but it's not like it falls down. All those pieces are still coming at you, or at least most of them. So now you've made it into a shotgun coming at you. So there, you have to think things through. I have a briefing on 94 ways to attack satellites without creating debris. So there's a lot of ways to do that. So space treaties, yeah, that's fine. It makes people feel good, a warm fuzzy in their heart or something. But there's a problem and a beauty with space. The problem is it's so far away and tens of thousands of kilometers away. It's very difficult to directly image a satellite. Anti-satellites don't have big red stars painted on the side that coming at you. You can tell who's attacking you and all that. What happens is in the middle of the night, suddenly the satellite stops working. And you can sit there and say, oh, well, gee, maybe it was a solar flare, or maybe it's like my computer that broke last month. They just, electronics break. Maybe a micrometeorite hit it. Maybe it was human caused, but accidental. Somebody got too close or whatever, or space debris or something hit it. Or maybe it was human caused and intentional. The trouble is you don't really know, and it takes you a long time to kind of figure that out. And I have a book on satellite failures, and you read through it, and every time a satellite fails, they do months of analyses, and they say, well, we think it's maybe this. Well, most space wars are over with in 24 to 48 hours. You're going to self-deter sitting there scratching your head, and it's like, gee, I don't know, was this satellite attacked? And was it accidental or intentional? And then by whom? And you could say, oh, gee, we're at war in the Western Pacific with China, with Taiwan or whatever, and my satellite stops working. You could almost childishly say, oh, it must have been the Chinese. But do you know, was it accidental? Was it natural caused? Was it caused by maybe Russians and North Koreans trying to stir the pot? So it's very confusing. And you can sit there and the war will be over before you have a chance of responding on that. And that's a problem. But there's also a beauty to the obscurity of space. And that is, countries love secrecy. Space allows them to show resolve and intent and will on each other, country to country, government to government, without getting the general populace all upset and understanding, that, oh, they attacked us, now we got to attack them. You think of the Falkland Islands conflict. I don't know how many decades ago that was. Did Britain really care about those islands, or did the populace get all upset and force them into some sort of war? So space, in some sense, provides additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder, where you can show resolve and will against each other, and play almost a diplomatic game, in space, and there's games being played. I mean, it's sort of like um, the 1960s, 70s Cold War, where you'd have Russian destroyers cutting off American destroyers in the Baltic or Atlantic, I don't know where. Sometimes smashing into them, maybe it was accidental, maybe it wasn't. It's this sort of cat and mouse game. Well, the same thing's going on in space.
Mm.
Everyone on the block has to have what are called RPO, rendezvous and proximity operations satellites. Now, that's a fancy name for something that just gets up close and kisses you, the kiss of death, maybe. And they're called maybe maintenance satellites, refueling satellites, repair satellites, inspector satellites. But the U.S. will probably talk about the 6 that they put up. China has them. Russia has them.
Mm.
France complains about the Russian inspector satellites getting too close to their military satellites and back and forth. And I'm sure there's this whole cat and mouse game going on right now over the Ukrainian conflict of other countries' satellites getting up close and inspecting. And, you could look at, let's say, an imagery satellite, come up close and look which way it's pointing on the ground, just which way the satellite's physically pointing. And you get ideas of, oh, they're interested in this part of Ukraine or something. Maybe they're planning a battle there or whatever. I mean, you can gather kinds of important intelligence data on this. But the secrecy, and this is what happened in the war in space that happened in 2014, the United States lost that, actually. And but they don't have to be embarrassed on the world stage. Uh, and in some sense, the American attacks on the GLONASS systems wasn't necessarily a military attack. I mean, if you think about it, Russia knows where everything's in Ukraine. It used to be part of their country. It's not like they need some fancy navigational to get around, things like that. The whole point of attacking Russian GLONASS satellites is to make a statement, to send a message saying, oh, you better stop whatever you're doing or else. And this is sort of the messaging that was sent um, I think it was earlier this year, where Russia did a direct ascent anti-satellite and blew up one of its own weather satellites. It was a test, but it's a threat. It's saying, oh, well, United States, whatever, you better not mess with us in space like you did in 2014 or else we'll go against. Now, the weather satellite is in a similar orbit to imagery satellites, so they probably were threatening National Reconnaissance Office satellites. And I think a week or two later, the Russians threatened to attack GPS too. So this whole diplomatic regime that space provides, again, intent and will, forcing on adversaries. And when we really think about war is a contest between adversary commanders' minds. You're trying to make him change his mind and the political leadership above him by using soldiers, sailors, Marines, and all that to force your will on them on the ground and all. But it ultimately is all messaging of stop whatever you're doing or whatever. And so space provides these additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder. And there's actually nothing too different from that. Last year, there was something in the open news that a Russian and an American submarine had an incident in the Sea of Japan. And, there's no CNN there with a news camera taking pictures. You don't know what that meant, but it's all under the water. And, you can get away with that kind of thing. The same way you go to CIA headquarters in McLean, Virginia, and there's supposedly a wall with all the stars of agents that died in the line of duty. Well, did any of those cause a war? Well, no, because they love the secrecy of the spies. They love the secrecy of submarine kind of things you're doing. They love the secrecy of space. And in some ways, that is, I think, good. It provides a safety release valve, so to speak, where countries can do mean things to each other and show, resolve and all this. So, but getting back to other incidents, like I say, there's been a whole bunch. I mentioned the Viasat attacks. There's probably been a bunch of them in space, but I don't know. I don't have security clearances anymore. I used to have 86 different ones, but they all timed out when I retired 10 years ago. But you can kind of read the tea leaves. For example, a few months back, Elon Musk said, "Oh, I didn't know my Starlink satellites were their antennas were being installed in Ukrainian drones and they were blowing up Russian tanks or something like that." So he said, "I'm going to stop allowing that." And I don't know how he does it, but I think there's like a mobile servers versus fixed. And so he turned it off for the Ukrainians. Now, that's very suspicious to me. It's like, oh, yeah, like he didn't really know that for the past year. And it implies to me, and I'm not sure, that the Russians got to him. It's about, you always got to look at the timing, synchronicity of, well, the
Mhm.
Russians are just starting this new counteroffensive and suddenly Elon backs off. And, I can fantasize that the Russians threatened him and his wife. Maybe they downloaded employee records and threatened to publish those. Or around that time, a bunch of newly launched Starlink satellites started falling out of orbit.
Oh
you
yeah,
know,
oh yeah, that was in the news.
and it's just like, well, I can't prove anything, but it's awfully suspicious. Now, there's a lot of suspicious behavior. For example, China, they have their GPS navigational satellites called Badao. They have some at medium Earth orbit, like the GPS system, but they have some at geosynchronous orbit. I think India does too. And they had one uh, geosynchronous Badao satellite that they said, oh, a few years ago, we launched it and it broke and it was drifting around the geobelt. So a few months ago, they said, we're going to take one of our RPO maintenance inspector satellites, whatever you want to call it, that had manipulator arms, robot arms. And, this again was in the open press, and the Chinese saying, oh, so we grabbed this errant Badao satellite and pulled it to graveyard orbit. That's what it says in the press. Well, I'm of a suspicious nature. And I say, okay, let's look at the facts. Graveyard orbit is plus or minus 300 kilometers
Yeah.
above and below geo. The Chinese pulled it to 3,000 kilometers. Now, fuel is everything in space. You're not going to waste that fuel unless you're trying to hide something. And again, looking at synchronicity, simultaneous things. 2 days earlier, the United States announced the launch of two more of their inspector satellites. And then 2 days later, the Chinese are getting rid of the evidence, to my mind. And I believe that this Badao satellite really wasn't dead. It was purposely put up there, faked its death, and it was drifting around the geosynchronous belt, inspecting other satellites. Maybe it had a little, something on it. As a matter of fact, let me show you a little something.
Yeah, sure.
This is a 7-watt green laser, and cost me about $200. This will set my furniture on fire across the room in a fraction of a second. Now, it's not space qualified, so maybe for $10,000, you can put one of these on a satellite, and if you're 100 feet away, you can do damage, with an inspector satellite. It's very easy to have some sort of cyber weapon on these satellites. And getting back to treaties, the trouble is verification. You don't know if there's some sort of secret space weapon inside, a weather satellite or some sort of other civilian satellite. There's no way to tell. And you have inspector satellites, you can get up and close, but there's like 48,000 objects up there now. You don't have enough time or fuel to go inspect everything. I mean, I always thought there's a whole bunch of rocket stages that are halfway between low Earth orbit and geosynchronous, from the 60s and 70s. And they're just floating around up there. And, these are really big rockets. They have exhaust cones the size of the room I'm in. You could hide a satellite in there. It's already, completed half of the Holman transfer to geosynchronous. You're halfway there. You could have some sort of space weapon sitting inside the cone for years, and no one's going to know it's there. Maybe you inserted it when it was over Antarctica or something like that. It's so easy to hide things in space, in spite of there's no hills and forests and stuff like that, because space is just so big, and it just varies. I don't know. I got way beyond your question, so hopefully
It's
that
too
answers.
big. It's too big to hide things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's just,
yeah, yeah.
and I've worked on programs like there's something called Smart Attitude, and that is you'd say satellite's a box, and the sun, reflects off one side and reflects back to Earth. Well, if you change the attitude of this satellite, so any solar speculars are called, reflecting off, reflect back into space, you're suddenly 18th magnitude. You're like really dark, and
Mhm.
that's you're not putting RAM, radar absorptive material on it. NASA a few years ago invented optical absorptive material. I guess it's really black. You
Mhm.
know, uh, there's a 1970s United States patent for a stealth satellite. You can look that up. Um, so you can reflect things off. I don't know, Uh, so it's probably very easy to do that. And also, the Europeans had what was called the Gochi satellite. And it was a few years back, it was launched, and it was measuring the gravitational potential around the Earth. It's kind of different. The Earth is lumpy and stuff like that. But they
Mhm.
had to have it so low to measure it correctly that it was slightly in the atmosphere, even though it was still in orbit. It had stubby little wings on it, and it had electric thrusters that constantly thrusted for 2.5 years to keep it up. Well, okay. So let's say you have some satellite that is really important to you, and it's a weapon, or maybe it's just supporting the military on the ground. And just before the war starts, you have this secret electric thruster, and you start thrusting, and you thrust for days, weeks, and so forth continuously. Well, you're no longer Keplerian orbital dynamics.
Yeah.
The algorithms for the radars and optical sensors are going to get confused, especially if you're randomly, thrusting,
Switching attitudes.
and you don't have like serial numbers painted on the side.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe you had a certain radar cross section or optical cross section, a certain brightness, certain size the radar dishes were used to for years. But then you blow up a balloon around it, or you change its attitude, or you make something come out and it
Mhm.
looks different, smells different. It's in a different orbit. It becomes what's called a uncorrelated target, UCT, which if you go every 2 weeks, I download the orbital element sets of all space objects up there, from Space Command site. And they close to half of all those 48,000 space objects that they are tracking, if they had found them, are called analyst objects, which means we don't know who launched those and what it does. In other words, you don't know anything what's happening in space, So it's very easy to hide. That's my theory. And it's getting worse. For some
Mm.
reason,
Oh, yeah.
translunar orbits, XGEO it's called, between geosynchronous and the moon. And suddenly it's a three-body orbital dynamics problem, and there's all sorts of crazy little orbits and things like that. And it's really far away. It's hard to see, and you got the dark side of the moon and all this. Uh, it's getting worse. It's not getting better, I guess.
Paul, coming to the question of translunar orbits and especially the trajectories, is there a need to patrol the cislunar trajectories?
Well, first of all, and usually that includes like the Lagrange points.
Hmm.
And the thing with the Lagrange points are they're exactly equal gravitational potential between the Earth, Moon, and Sun, I guess. Um, And what it is it just sits there because
Mm,
everything's pulling on it equally. But all it takes is a little bit of nudge, and it starts, falling down the gravity well towards the Earth, maybe towards the moon, and comes screaming into, geosynchronous orbit and does something to you,
mm,
you know.
mhm.
And I don't think we have very good radars to see that happening. But the moon is kind of funny to me. I've worked this close to 50 years, and I remember in the 60s and 70s, NASA asked the U.S. Air Force, "Oh, do you guys want a base on the moon?" And the Air Force sort of scratched his head and said, "Well, gee, that's awfully far away. I guess we don't really need it. We didn't see anything that was useful." So the moon has been totally not an issue until the last 3 to 5 years, and suddenly it really is an issue now.
Yeah, yeah.
And all these, and then it's like crazy things like companies saying, "Oh, I'm going to put cell phone service around the moon." It's like, what the hell are you talking
Yeah.
about? ten
Nokia did
thousand
that.
dollars a minute for astronauts who don't even live there yet, and private firms putting up space surveillance, and it's like, I don't understand what's going there. Now I have this, I guess it's a fantasy, but you have the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that China is a signatory to, that says you can't own celestial bodies. Well,
Mhm.
I could theorize that 10 minutes before Chinese takonauts land on the moon, they abrogate the 1967 treaty and say, we own the whole moon, you know? And people say, oh, you're crazy, and I'm not a lawyer and all that. But a NASA administrator a few months ago said the very same thing. So maybe
Mhm.
that's what they're worried about. I don't know. To me, it's like Spain owned all of the Western Hemisphere. The Pope told them so, hundreds of years ago. Well, good luck defending that, kind of thing. But it just seems there's this new emphasis on the moon, and I don't exactly get it. Uh, Maybe people are putting weapons up there to come at. See, the trouble is, there's no colonies you're defending. There's no military satellites you're defending. What do you care? You only care about satellites from Leo to geosynchronous, so to speak. Um, and you only care, the only purpose, and I know this is a sin for the Space Force, but their only purpose for all these military satellites is to support the ground battle. There's no colonies in space that you're defending and all that. It's all about the ground battle. And I just find it hard to believe, the terrestrial battle, Army, Navy, Air Force, and all. I find it hard to believe that the moon has a role in that. It takes days, weeks, I know, to come back from the moon and
Mm.
all that. But I must be missing something because it sure seems important. And there's, funny businesses going on. Like one company said, oh, yeah, we're putting up space surveillance on the dark side of the moon. It's like, yeah, I don't know why. And they say, oh, we have extra room in our spacecraft. Does any companies want to come with us? There was some article in Space News or something like that. And then the CEO of this company said, yeah, we have this room, but we don't care if you come or not. And, what company on earth doesn't care about getting extra money from bringing another passenger? Well, a company that's a cutout, that's not really a company. It's, the Air Force, Space Force, or something, putting up some sort of payload, who knows what.
Mhm.
They all love this secrecy stuff. Um, I don't know. Yeah. So is there a need there? I haven't seen anyone demonstrate a need why we have to see that. But there must be some classified things happening. Now I can fantasize, aliens on the moon and all that. I have no, information on that or anything like that. I know a lot of people enjoy that. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
can't answer your question.
There's an audience for that too. But,
Yeah, and
but
I don't want to start those kind of conspiracy theories. Though I used
okay.
to work at a place that they used to brief people in, and it was called Project Wildflower, I think. And it was a fake thing. They were just joking, but they said, "Oh, we found alien artifacts in the moon and stuff like that." And they used to call us the DARK, the Dead Alien Research Center, He was even on the board, the official board of the Air Force board. But it was all joking. It wasn't really true, you know.
So this is fun. This is fun. So you pointed out that many academic institutions, multilateral institutions, they often discuss about the peaceful use of outer space. But when they talk about peace, they do not talk about the escalation ladder. Now, you've spoken a lot about escalation ladder and you share a lot of content on it. So, especially now with so many players coming in, joining in, we just had Kenya launch its satellite via Falcon 9. We have many African countries, Asian countries now having their own assets in outer space. You know, how does this all pan out with so many players coming in outer space?
Well, and again, I remember, I mentioned, how do you know who's attacking you, or even if you've been attacked? Now, go ahead and do your treaties, but I'm kind of Machiavellian about it. Well, first of all, there's a quote by some famous commie, I forget who. He says, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you."
In you,
So
yeah.
you could be, some flower child that says, "Oh, we don't want weapons in space and this and that." Well, there's already been 10 space wars, guys. And it's too late to talk about that. And there's no way of validation to make sure it really didn't happen. And then you could be Machiavellian about it. It's these same kind of people who are saying, "Oh, we should ban war in Antarctica." And I'm thinking, boy, that's a perfect place for war. You're not bombing Ukrainian cities and killing people. If you really want to, say, well, war is going to happen, and the snow covers everything afterwards.
Mm,
Is that true of space?
mm,
That you get to the point of, let's say, the United States, would it prosecute a war in the Western Pacific if it didn't have GPS to be able to make accurate missiles, hit accurately, hit the target, that have imagery satellites or signals intelligence satellites to see, oh, where are the anti-aircraft batteries, and to be able to avoid them. And then you need GPS to be able to loop around them. You need to be able to see which targets to attack. You need to see, well, did that bomb really help when you need to attack it again? You need to communicate with your forces. You need weather information to know about the trafficability of the ground. How wet is it? Are the tanks going to sink in? I mean, all of this. If you suddenly lost the space war, would you even prosecute a ground war? And again, there's
mm,
no colonies in space. There's no reason to attack the International Space Station. You're just killing billions of dollars of space gear, and the wars may be over with. It almost sounds like one of those 1960s Star Trek movie things, but it's
mm,
kind of a little more sophisticated than that. And that is the satellite orbits. Let's say you have a space weapon, an ASAT, anti-satellite, and you want to start maneuvering to attack a target. Well, there's only specific times in that orbit that you can start maneuvering. It's not a continuous thing. And if you add that all up, you could say, well, there's certain choke points in space. They're not necessarily fixed, but mathematical choke points,
mm,
inclination, altitude kind of thing. That if an adversary wanted to take out, uh, let's say, space assets that support the Western Pacific, a potential battlefield in the Western Pacific, you would need to build up your space weapons in these particular choke points. And that choke point would be different if you want to deny somebody's ability to use space in Europe, let's say. So if you had very good situational awareness, your radars or whatever, you could see the buildup of those forces, these space weapons at the choke points. And maybe you can frustrate those attacks by attacking the weapons first, or by simply going to the United Nations and saying, look, it looks like they're about to attack the United States in space. Any smart adversary would do that first before they attack on the ground, to take out the United States' eyes and ears in space so they wouldn't see which way the forces are going, things like that. It looks like if they're building up to attack the United States in space, it must mean they're about to attack on the ground. So what I'm getting at is, Space warfare is maybe a just kind of war that avoids war on the ground, you know, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
happening very soon. Or if it isn't, happening now, I don't know how the United States would prosecute war in the West Pacific if they no longer have satellites to communicate back to the United States. These carrier battle groups and stuff like that. I doubt they use troposcatter communications much anymore and all that. So there's one thing that the United States has very much gone down the route of technologic superiority and saying, oh, we can win wars because of this superiority. But if you look in Ukraine, the Russian equipment isn't particularly superior, but is rugged. And I heard a crazy thing yesterday. The Ukrainians are saying we need F-16s and things like that. And the United States can't send them there because the Ukrainian airfields are so rough that the F-16s have this big air intake in the bottom, and all these stones and debris would go into
Just
the
take it to
engine.
yeah.
The F-16 is built with very light landing gear that can't take the very rough airfields that are built for Russian kind of tougher things. And so they can't take off, and they certainly can't land. They were all smashed. So they said the first thing to indicate if the F-16s are showing up in Ukraine is to see if they're redoing the airfields. And so you can fool yourself with this technologic superiority, but you go back to World War II, the Germans were superior in aircraft, tanks, machine guns, whatever, and superior in doctrine and everything. Well, that didn't do them much good, now did it? So one has to kind of back off on that, and space certainly provides a degree of technologic superiority. I mean, to be able to communicate tactically on the ground for the Ukrainian and Russian forces, I'm sure is very important. To be able to have navigational, to be able to see where you're going, to make your drones more accurate and stuff like that. Certainly to be able to get imagery data. I mean, even the commercial satellite operators are providing imagery data to Ukraine that's showing, well, look at these Russian forces building up. You better do something about it. I mean, that's very important. And I'm actually surprised that the Russians have let them get away with it. I was in France a year and a half ago, spending a week briefing the French Air and Space Force, and they proudly told me about their mobile laser blinder system that, runs around and can blind satellites, or they turn up the power and damage it. Now, I'm very surprised that the Russians, I'm sure, have their own mobile laser blinders, haven't been blinding, these silly commercial satellites who think they can play war with the big boys.
Yeah.
Maybe they will start that when they have the Russian major counteroffensive. I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of political thing that's happening that they don't want to go there, and escalate or whatever. But yeah, space is a funny thing, and you can get away with a lot. And I've realized just over the last few months that countries are just like children. They'll do anything they want if they get away with it from their parents. And the parents now are like the United Nations or their own citizens or something like that. So, you can get away with a lot in space. You can get away with submarine warfare or probably even in the ground warfare in Ukraine. I'm sure there's atrocities happening and no one's there to see them. And I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's a gray zone completely.
So what else?
So, Paul, you mentioned about that there are many countries around the world that are voluntarily announcing the self-restraint and inhibition to launch any direct ascent satellite, anti-satellite missile. Now, is it because a direct ascent weapon has no political takers, or the world has completely moved on to uh, non-kinetic anti-satellite or space weapons?
Well, it seems like when you first start out as a country, that's your method, is these direct descent. I mean, the U.S. had some. I was on the program at the Pentagon, the F-15 anti-satellite, and India did it. China, was it 2007 or something like that, did it. Russia had this anti-satellite that had all these pellets come out and things like that.
Yeah.
So when you're first starting, that's the in thing. The space to space, like I said, I mentioned 3 countries. I just read in the open press, France is putting up their own inspector satellite with one of those lasers I was mentioning. Who knows if they'll have manipulator arms and stuff like that. Okay, the issues. These manipulator inspector satellites are ideal. It's like taking a satellite, putting it in a wheelbarrow and wheeling it into your garage and then going at it. Well, let's drill a hole here. Let's bend this. Let's cut this wire. Let's move this, and all this. So that's in some sense ideal. The trouble is it's not too useful so far for lower Earth orbits because you need a human in the loop. And I've been part of programs developing these ground control systems for these RPO inspector satellites where you have 2 joysticks, 6 degrees of freedom. There's a complication of you don't want to go in front of the multi-kilowatt communication antennas. It would fry you. You don't want to be near the reaction jets that would pollute your sensors. Maybe you don't want to go past the star sensors because they see a blip and they know you're there. I mean, it's a complicated thing, and artificial intelligence isn't good enough to do that. So it has to be a human in there. But the trouble there is if it's low Earth orbit, it's only a 5 to 7 minute pass, and then the thing's gone. It's over Antarctica or something like that. Yeah. So what you need is a relay satellite way up in geosynchronous to relay the signals back for the human interaction. But then that makes that relay satellite very vulnerable. And another choke point. And it takes days and weeks to maneuver these satellites up close to get them. And that's not militarily responsive as far as I'm concerned, especially the space war is over within 24 hours. So it's a tool for just sort of messing with your adversary, or maybe pre-conflict intel gathering. Maybe just as a conflict starting, you could mess with a few satellites and all that. So that's not as effective. And so I'm getting at is a direct descent, blow the hell out of them, is very effective because you see, the debris and all that. But then it's politically wrong. And the other rule here that people don't understand, and particularly the Space Force, is you're not really fighting the war. You're fighting the peace. The whole point of the war is geopolitical realignments afterwards. And so you might have all these whiz bang, I love these space weapons, and we blew the hell out of them. And now you created all this debris, and then you lost the war. Oh no, you lost the peace because your allies hate you with all that, space debris around there and all that. So you got to think that through. So, okay, direct descent is kind of bad, but it's something that you really know that worked. Now you can have space to space that can create debris. The treaties aren't covering that because they're idiots, I guess. The treaties are for popular imagination, but not necessarily for reality on that. But at any rate, so the more popular thing nowadays is cyber warfare. And that's been popular for many years against satellites. But I don't know about that. I have this thought experiment that let's say you're in the trenches in Ukraine and you hear the Russian tank engines revving up to come attack you. So just before that happens, this egghead scientist shows up in your trenches, and he has this black box with the big red button in the center. And he says, I've tested this in the lab. It's a cyber weapon. You push this button, and it will attack those tanks, and they'll stop. I assure you, we haven't tested it in the field, but I assure you it works, even though I have no military experience or anything. And unfortunately, we spent all your money and we
Mhm.
can't afford this anti-tank bazooka. So good
Mhm.
luck with this cyber weapon, you know. And
Mhm.
so the tanks rev up, they start attacking. He pushes the big red button. The tanks stop, and 30 seconds later, they reboot, rev up, and squish them, you know. And so
Mhm.
the moral of the story is, and I don't know about you, but as a guy, a big flaming hole in the ground where the tank used to be is much more emotionally satisfying than a cyber weapon. And
Yeah.
that's even more true in space. Oh, I did the cyber weapon. Oh, the satellite stopped. Well, maybe it's faking it out. Do you really know? You know. So it's a
It's
popular
difficult to attribute.
yeah, and how you well that's why they like it, you know.
That's why they
Well,
like
it's
it.
necessarily not necessarily creating debris. You can't
Mm.
attribute who did it. You know, it's
Mhm.
like the Iranian centrifuges. You know, did Iran, Israel attack them, and you know, you can get away with it in a court of law or a court of public opinion. I mean, who knows? Your satellite stops working, and you can't prove it one way or the other. You can't look at the electrons and say, "Oh yeah, yeah." I mean, it's like you shoot down an aircraft. Well, you can
Mm.
see the wreckage. You can see parts of the missile with the serial number. I mean, you could make some conclusions with it. But in space, it's too far away to go up there and kick the metal and see what's wrong on that. And plus, even if you know it was the bad guys that did it, because countries love secrecy, they're not going to say anything about
I'm
it.
going to say it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
which is, I guess, good. You know, you need this safety valve and things like that. I mean, for all I know, there's been a big space war happening over the Ukraine, or will happen soon enough, and they can get away with it without us. You know, we're all fat, dumb, and happy, sitting in the ground, not knowing, you know, what's coming off. So direct descent, yeah, cool. Um, I guess the latest thing they think is the manipulator satellites because you really know you did it. I don't know. You know, it just seemed to me if you put this electrostatic net around a satellite, it suddenly can't do anything.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of a dumb idea, but you know, it can't communicate out. You know, it's a not a Helmholtz, whatever Faraday cage.
Faraday cage.
You can't maneuver around, can't maneuver. I don't know. You can do something real simple like that. I mean, I thought of things like uh, even though if you know, a lot of people don't seem to understand this, but if you take a hunk of aluminum and a magnet, it won't stick to it. But if you turn the magnet around rapidly, it will. It's creating eddy currents and all that, and it will stick to it. So you could have this space mine or something like that to attaches to a satellite, spinning something in there to, you know, to attach to the aluminum shell, and
Mm.
it makes the satellite out of balance.
Mm.
Suddenly, all the algorithms on board can't figure it out and all that. And then every half hour, you change to a new location. You know, now you're not
Mm.
creating space debris, but you're really messing up that satellite. You know, these things are like again fantasizing, but satellites they have to point very precisely to the ground and they
Mhm.
use star maps, star sensors to look at the stars and say, "Oh, this is where the satellite's pointing." You know, well,
Yeah.
if you had
Yeah.
one of these inspector satellites come up to the star sensor and present an upside down star map, would you flip the satellite? And there's the thing with satellites is they're invented by engineers who believe in perfection. And so this
Mm.
satellite failure book I was mentioning, it's like, oh, we didn't know it would point into the bright moon, or we didn't know this would happen, and this is why the satellite flipped up and all that. So it's probably very easy to confuse and mess with a satellite. I'm not sure about the timelines and all that. You know, if you've got a really quick war, maybe sometimes you just need to blow the hell out of things. You know, I don't
Mhm.
know. It just
Well,
depends on the orbits and all that.
you just mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 times the duration of the war, the duration of the space war. So it doesn't last, according to you, for more than 48 hours.
Yeah, I have software I developed how to fight space wars, and it goes through the orbital dynamics and the targeting and things like that. But what I did is I took 100 random space objects, and I said match the orbits of another 100 random space objects, and so the thing calculated all those, and 96% of them matched the orbit of their target. In other words, attacked it,
Mm,
however,
mm, mhm.
within 24 hours. you
Okay.
know, so if you're really serious about space war, and I don't think the Space Force really understands this. They keep thinking tactically. And there's
Mm,
something, Sun Tzu, um, I'll probably get this wrong, but a quote from him, from over 2,000 years ago. He says, strategy without tactics makes for a very long war. Tactics without strategy is just the noise before defeat. And
mhm,
people
mm,
aren't thinking strategy for space. Like, oh, well, yeah, this one satellite's coming attacking me. Well, what if 50 satellites are attacking? Um, can we divine intent from the adversary? Is he going against command and control imagery? Is it just a diplomatic attack, showing intent and resolve and will? What's the timing of it? Does the timing imply he's doing something on the ground? No one seems to be thinking through these bigger things. And my gosh, it's so obvious. Satellites are strategic. They cover the Earth.
yeah.
Anything you do tactically to that satellite has strategic consequences. And I did analyses decades ago. The what do you call it? The 1991 Desert Storm, and I knew the Navy captain who was in charge of Schwarzkopf's intel staff. And he said they were worried about the French spot imagery satellite that would reveal this left hook. So, according to this Navy captain, Schwarzkopf purposely put the French forces in the leftmost vulnerable part of the left hook to make sure they turn off that spot satellite imagery so the Iraqis couldn't get it. And if you look to a lot of people don't know, America bombed all the satellite heavy Earth terminals in Iraq and even the um, space research facilities and things like that. Well, let's say we have another Middle Eastern war
Mhm,
and you want to deny the adversary imagery satellites to see disposition of forces and things like that. You're not exactly allowed to blow up that satellite. It's a commercial satellite. You don't really want to be killing that, even though your adversary is downloading that data. Uh, okay, you can blow up maybe his, Earth receiver terminals, and maybe you can blind it. But the trouble is that satellite goes past the battlefield, comes over again. It comes over a ground station in Thailand. Now,
mhm,
are you going to drop a bomb on a ground station in Thailand? No, I don't think so. That information can then come through submarine cables back to the Middle East. Are you going to blow up a submarine cable, cut it? No, I don't think so. Maybe, they cut the Nord Stream pipeline, because you can get away with it. No one can prove who did it. But
yeah.
you have to think globally if you're
Mhm,
talking about space. There's hundreds of different ground sites that you have to deal with if you're trying to deny information. And that's what space is all about. It provides information. It provides navigational imagery, signals intelligence, weather, and transmits that information via um, communication satellites. So you're really talking about information warfare. And again,
mhm,
you have to have a broader perspective. You're
yeah.
not attacking the satellite, you're attacking the mission that the satellite provides. It provides this imagery information. Oh, by the way, you better take out the drone providing the same information too. And so you're not attacking the satellite, you're attacking the mission. And in some sense, you're not attacking the mission, you're attacking the information.
Information.
And
Yeah.
what you're really attacking is the adversary commander's mind who uses that information. And you're denying his ability to see the battlefield
Mhm,
and attack left or attack right. Now, the
right.
trouble is, you can't mathematically prove, oh, I just spent $100 million in this great space weapons program and I denied the adversary the ability to image the battlefield.
Mhm,
Okay, how can you prove how that affected the battle? Did the battle end 10 days earlier and there's 5,000 fewer casualties? Can you mathematically prove that? Now, the Army does that. They say, oh, if you take out this bridge, it delays the forces 6 hours, it reduces casualty exchange ratios. They have these models, but you're talking about information warfare, and that's what we're talking about for space. You're denying information to the adversary. So, should you spend $100 million on this fancy space weapons program, or $100 million for an extra army division on the ground? And which is more effective? Well, that's pretty hard to figure.
Yeah, that's a
That's
tough
why I
question.
propose we should have a space warfare think tank that, like Rand Corporation and things like that, just start going through all these issues of escalation control. And, is it better to take out adversary imagery, satellites, or communications? And it depends. I mean, if you can say, well, let's say we're going to war in the Western Pacific, and the Chinese psychology is totalitarian. Maybe, I don't really know. I've never been there. But if we deny command and control so that adversary Chinese commanders can't communicate with their troops, the troops will freeze and do nothing
Mm.
because they were taught they'll get shot if they take their own initiative. So in the Western Pacific, we should have weapons we designed and maybe kind of based there to go against command and control. I'm theorizing here, but it seems to make sense. And then in Europe, well, Americans, I've talked to these guys, they don't even follow their own doctrine. Now, I don't know about Russia and all that, but it seems to me maybe it's better to go against imagery satellites there, because if they lose, in being in touch with their commanders, they'll still fight and they'll take initiative and things like that. So these are the kinds of things you got to think about before you spend billions of dollars on all this space gear, because it really feels good. It's really cool. It's Star Wars.
Yeah. People salivate on gizmos,
Yeah.
but they don't think in a strategic manner, and that has
Well,
been a major issue.
why do you use it? When do you use it? And what's the
Exactly.
consequences
What's
afterwards, especially in the peacetime environment?
Yeah, yeah. On that note, we'll close today's program. Thank you, Paul. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm pretty sure my audience will dig into this again and again. You've given them a lot to think on it. And we hope to see you again on this program very soon with as animated conversation as we had today.